Introduce myself. This is Steve Spear, senior lecturer at MIT. Peter has mentioned that already. And I just want to say how delighted I am to spend time with you, and also thank Peter and his colleagues for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you. Just as Peter was introducing, I'm author of a book called The High Velocity Edge. Also a new book forthcoming with a fellow named Gene Kim called Wiring the Winning Organization. And common theme in all my work is about how you achieve great outcomes in organizations. And the punchline is create an environment in which it's really, really easy to learn. And I just want to give a plug to the Sloan School's executive education program, which is always experimenting with platforms like this. And it's been just a delight to work with them. So in terms of the theme of what I've written about, what I teach in the various courses we have at MIT, online, in person, live online, asynchronous online, the motivating question is, all else equal, why is it that certain organizations just are so much better able to generate and deliver value into society, multiples, if not orders of magnitude, better than anybody else? And the thing I want to really emphasize here is that there's a thinking that the way to gain competitive advantage is by inhibiting competition. Oh, well, if I have barriers to entry or exit, if I can lock up my customers, if I can lock up my suppliers, if I can reduce competition and substitutes from others, somehow that's going to give me the secret sauce. And we can spend a whole lot of time looking for those unicorn-like positions where no one else can intrude. It's almost like a castle on a hill with a moat and drawbridges, and there I'm fine. But the reality is, for most organizations, even some very, very large ones, there is no statically defensible position, right? Everyone has access to the same resources, same opportunities, same ideas, same technology, capital, equipment, et cetera, et cetera. And so then it begs the question, how do you gain such enormous advantage there? And the answer is quite simple. If everything else is equal, the only difference is your management system. And in particular, how well does that management system create conditions in which the people for whom you're responsible can solve problems individually? And how well does the work their minds are doing come together through collective action towards common purpose? And that's been the consistent theme across the work we've been doing for, at this point, I guess it's decades. Peter, welcome back. The Wi-Fi is up and running again. So,
thank you, Steve. I'm not sure whether that was my Wi-Fi or the other internet gremlins that we were having, but it seemed very relevant to the topic that we're talking about today. So thank you for doing your own introduction.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. And everyone, I'm Peter Hurst, Senior Associate Dean for Executive Education at the MIT Sloan School. Delighted to be, I originally said be joined by Stephen Spear, but I suppose I now have to say delighted to be joining Stephen Spear, who was already here before me for this LinkedIn Live. And hopefully you have all managed to find this second broadcast version of the broadcast, so you'll be able to start asking some questions of Steve as the next 45 minutes or so goes on. But while we wait for you to compose some questions, maybe I can just start, Steve, by asking you to go back a little bit in time. The last time we did one of these, we were talking mostly about high velocity organizations based on your book by a very similar title, which you teach in a variety of formats here in executive education for us. I characterize that book and that course as being really about what is it that we need to know and do as leaders and designers of organizations to really out-innovate our competitors on a continuing and ongoing basis, not just to beat them once, but to beat them over and over again for the long term. And so I'm really curious about what your journey has been from those concepts to this concept now of wiring the winning organization, which is the title of your next book, which will be coming out in a few months.
That's right. Yeah, thank you very much. So for what it's worth, it's not like we said, oh, the old book is junk, throw it out. We got to start from scratch. It's not that at all. It's a matter of taking what we learned there and building on that foundation and adding to it. And in fact, this whole idea of incrementalism is a very important part of what we've done. So let me just step back and talk about the motivations for the first book and the second one. The first book grew out of my experience as a graduate student at MIT in the late 80s, early 90s, when everyone was worried about industrial competitiveness and this sort of existential threat that was coming from Japanese manufacturing companies. And those who know a little bit of my history, I spent a good amount of time very Karate Kid fashion, delving into what was going on inside Toyota, and particularly on the operating side of its business, that given the same market opportunities, the same access to suppliers, access to the same labor pools, et cetera, they were able to deliver, many more products in greater volume, greater variety, greater productivity, higher quality, shorter lead times to market, on and on and on. And when we took a close look at that, what we came to appreciate is that for all the study of Toyota for things like production control tools and algorithms, what they had really figured out was the human side of the enterprise, which was how to create an environment in which they were constantly building human capital and taking advantage of people's innate creativity, which was then trained and tuned to be really productive creativity in terms of problem solving, and harness this intellect distributed throughout the enterprise towards the common purpose of delivering value into society. So that's where I was in terms of my research writing through about 2010. So what's changed is that since 2010, I've had opportunity to work with people across a much broader range of sectors. So if, playing on the title of the movie, Planes, Trains, Automobiles. So it's been planes, trains, automobiles, military applications, product development in pharmaceuticals and biotech and high tech, so on and so forth. So the span of sectors has widened. And also, my research originally was very much rooted in the operating environment of production. And since then, we've had a chance to not only widen the sectors, but widen the phases of value creation to way upstream things like early stage research and development and discovery and R&D and product design and so on and so forth. So that's one change. And I'll talk to the title that we've been using, which is this notion of wiring. And this is something that's sort of come out, is that when we tend to think about where people invest their creativity, and I got a little, where they invest their creativity, especially a place like MIT, we tend to think about bench tops, literally or figuratively. There's a bench top and there's an object sitting on top of that bench top. And that back in the day, that object might have been a mechanical gear going into a mechanical system. Today, it might be a gene, and all sorts of other objects which sit on bench tops. And it's certainly wickedly important to have smart people who have very, very good rigorous problem solving to figure out how that object works. So that's layer one. And then what we've come to appreciate is that there's a second layer, which is largely a scientific, technical engineering layer, which is the instrumentation through which we work on that object. Last year, at least, I've been doing a lot of work with shipyards where they do major overhauls on these fantastic vessels. And so in terms of objects, there's the actual weld, and then there's the instrumentation, which the welding equipment, which creates that weld. So that's a second layer, in which we have to have really great aptitude and skill. But there's a third layer, and this is the layer which typically goes away from being thought of in rigorous first principle kind of ways to sort of nebulous kind of ways. And the third layer is what we've been calling the social circuitry, hence the title of the book, Wiring the Winning Organization. And that notion, social circuitry, is not arbitrary or metaphorical. It's the processes, it's the routines, it's the procedures by which the work of individuals is harnessed together through collective action towards common purpose. And our assertion in Wiring the Winning Organization is that you get that social circuitry right, you wire that correctly, and it is wicked easy for individuals to solve problems, and not only individually, but have collaborative problem solving and sort of critical mass problem solving go on super well. And you get that wiring wrong, and people are spending so much flipping time trying to figure out where they fit into the larger enterprise. What do I do? Who do I do it for? Who am I dependent on? When do I do it? How do I get it done? That so much of what is that precious resource of human creativity, so much of that precious resource is invested in just trying to figure out the layer 3 processes and procedures and routines, that hardly any is left for actually the real problems that we're asked to solve, which is at layer 1, the thing on the bench top, and layer 2, how to use the instrumentation. So anyway, in terms of the delta between the last book and the forthcoming book, I think we've gotten much greater clarity that there's huge, enormous advantage to be won on the layer 3 social circuitry. And I think we can inform that argument by a much broader range of examples across sectors and across phases of value creation than I might have been able to do on my own a decade or so ago.
Thanks, Steve. That's really helpful context. And to get right into it, could you tell us a bit more about, I think we understand sort of the metaphor of wiring, but can you actually tell us something more about what you actually mean by wiring, what it looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about wiring of any kind, what does wiring do? It takes something which is an available and in supply in one location, but where it's not necessarily needed. And then what we do is we create a circuit so that it can go to someplace else where it's maybe in short supply, but actually is necessary. And that's what a wire does for electrons. That's what a pipe does for fluids. We create these wirings. You start thinking about the patterns of communication in an organization. Ideally, the best wiring is that if you and I are working on a problem where both our inputs are needed and the problem itself is going to inform both our efforts, that you and I have a direct linkage. So if something pops up and I have an issue, I can say, hey, Peter, what's going on? And you can inform that back to me. But here's what we have happen very often in organizations is that I get popped into a group which is defined by my discipline, my function, my specialty, et cetera, et cetera. And you get popped into a different part of the organization, which is also labeled by your functional expertise. And in order to get things done, if I need a resource, typically I can't find it on my own because I'm sitting inside some boundary. And in order to get it, I have to percolate the question all the way up to the top of the silo. It comes across, it finds somebody else there, coordinated at a very senior level, comes all the way down. And you start thinking about drawing a literal circuit where you want to connect these 2 points, but instead of connecting them directly, so you have low impedance and high flow, et cetera, instead what you have is you create a wiring which goes way up and way across and way back down and back and forth and back and forth. There's no way that circuit's going to perform well. So one of the mechanisms we talk in the book is about how do we change the structure of communication and collaboration so things are way more linear and way more simpler, so that the person who has information and an idea can flow that directly to the person who needs it. And not only that, but if there's uncertainty about that has to be resolved, they can have that direct peer-to-peer conversation rather than having it go up to the top of a silo, across and back down. So those are some of the things that we're talking about in the book, and particularly to the issue of wiring, this notion of taking very complex things and simplifying the flows so it's more obvious with whom you're working, on whom you depend, who depends on you, and with whom should be having these very rich, fruitful, productive, collaborative conversations. That's more obvious.
Great. That's helpful, Stephen. One of the things that I think of when I think of wiring is, you look at some wiring in circuits and it looks kind of like a bird's nest.
That's
lots
right.
of point and stuff going all over the place. And then you look at some other and you've got a super well-designed circuit board where everything is laid out. And, do you see any differences between, does the metaphor stretch this far in what you think?
The metaphor stretches this far and much further, actually. So, in the courses I teach and in the book I'm now writing, we talk about different mechanisms by which those responsible for others can make it easier for those others to solve really hard problems and have that problem-solving effort coalesce beautifully. And to your notion of a circuit board, so you start thinking about what folks who design legitimate circuit boards do. The one thing they don't do is have all the wires cross all the other wires all the time in all the place. Now there's reasons for that, right? So at an electrical level, you create all sorts of opportunity for interference and that kind of thing. But let's take this up from layer 1, the object, all the way up to layer 3, which is the social circuitry. If you tried to design a very sophisticated electrical apparatus with the wiring which is going this place and that place and this place, the ability to get people to solve problems becomes wildly difficult, right? It becomes wildly difficult to do that. And why is that? Because you've created such a complex object that one, just understanding it is wicked hard, because what's connected to what in first and second and third and fourth and 16th order effects is very hard to discern. But there's another problem. Once you have at layer 1 such a interwoven complexity, layer 3 of who should be talking to whom about what, when, that also becomes wildly difficult to discern. And I think we've all experienced those symptoms, is that when we've designed something terribly complex without consideration for how people will have to design and improve and solve problems around it, we find ourselves either in meetings all the time, which seem to have no value, but just in case something gets said that's actually important, we show up to the meeting, or we find out something's been discussed and decided that actually affects us, but we weren't part of the discussion. So we work through a couple of mechanisms which occur at layer 1, which affect layer 3 and back and forth. And one is just this sort of impulse to modularize things. And as a plug here, this thinking is highly influenced by a long-term teacher, mentor, colleague, Steve Eppinger, who talks a lot about modularization. And you start thinking about the value of modularization is that the layer 1 thing on the benchtop, when you take the big thing and start breaking it up into individual pieces, the individual pieces are much easier to understand than the whole big thing, because it's much less intertwining and all of that. And not only that, the little things, because they're self-contained, they're coherent, they involve the creative contributions of fewer people in the whole big thing, it's a lot easier to understand those things, experiment with those things, change those things, update and update and update. And so anyway, this idea, Peter, of modularization becomes wicked important. And it's informed, of course, by practice, where we see some of the great tech leaders very deliberately modularizing the systems they build, the systems on which they depend. And why is that? In order to make it much easier for the people who are in their enterprise to solve problems independently with freedom of action in parallel, rather than having everyone jammed into these pointless meetings where everyone's there and nothing gets done.
Great. So this, I hear you describing something which is easy to imagine working in the realm of continuous improvement and innovation that drives continuous improvement, and you're trying to create the system and the structure that enables people to do that quickly and efficiently and effectively. Is that right?
Yes, and yeah, the end part is that it's not only taking these approaches to take systems which already pre-exist and advance them from when they are, but what we see is that these mechanisms which we've been exploring not only are helpful but necessary for giant leap type undertakings. And I deliberately use the phrase giant leap. One of the cases we develop out in the book is closing the gap between President Kennedy's aspirations in May 1961 to send a man on to the moon and have him return safely to the Earth by the end of the decade, and actually accomplishing that in July 1969. And you start looking at what NASA did there, and at no point did anyone actually sketch out a priori. Apollo 11, how it was going to land. What they did was they took this enormous problem, which involved propulsion, navigation, communication, life support, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and said that's too many factors to consider all at once. So what they do? They broke the very, very big problem into much smaller pieces. So you have the Apollo program preceded by the Gemini program, preceded by the Mercury program. And the Mercury program, they said, we've actually never launched anybody into space. And there's a lot of challenges right there. So what they do, before they try to design the whole system, they said, well, we have launched things into space, just not people. So let's partition the problem. We're going to make the first launch on top of a Redstone rocket because that's known and reliable, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to work on the increment. And the increment is the capsule, which has to have life support and communication and re-entry and just preservation of human life and well-being. And so there's that piece. And then they move on to the second launch in that program. Again, they build it on a Redstone rocket. It's not going to go into orbit, and it's not going to go very high into outer space, but it's a known platform. And they improve on the capsule for that. Then when we get to John Glenn, first orbit, they put that on top of an Atlas rocket. And again, it's this whole idea of decomposing this very, very big problem into much smaller, manageable pieces. Because on the first flight and the second flight, what was the novelty? It was the capsule. Then they bring the capsule over. Now what's the novelty? It's how that capsule interacts not with the Redstone rocket, but onto the Atlas rocket. And then through the rest of the Mercury program, there's a lot of these other high-speed, fast feedback very knowledge and learning rich experiences, which run through the Gemini program, 6 flights before you move on to Mercury. So anyway, Peter, your question is to these techniques, do they help with advancing on something which is already established? Absolutely. All the more so, things where our starting point is very, very little knowledge. These mechanisms are wildly helpful, because if we just try to jump in to the problem in its entirety, it'd be impossible. So if we break it up into little bitty pieces and explore incrementally and keep pushing the frontiers of what we know, that's something that our minds can get wrapped around.
Great, that's helpful. And as you were describing that, a question that Valerie asked actually jumped out at me. Valerie asked whether we could speak to the role of shared language across disciplines plays in wiring the social circuitry. And the examples that you just talked about, so this modularization, that could also be a kind of balkanization, right? So presumably this issue of having common language and purpose across these different elements, but also the different disciplines and skill sets that you might be deploying in those different elements must be an issue. So what have you seen about that?
Yeah, so let's keep going with this idea that what we want to do is take these very big intractable problems and partition them so we can get our minds around the smaller pieces. So this starts speaking into the issue of common language and vernacular, is that if we're trying to talk across an entire project, program, whatever else it is, we have so many people. I'll give you an example, Peter. You want to give an example of just the language complexity. And I'm backtracking way from the cutting edge of innovation to something which is common. So I was in a factory which builds Tundra and Sequoia trucks. And I happened to be entering that factory through the good hospitality of the folks who supply the seat sets into it. Now, get this. Just the seat set. This is, the front row, back row, maybe third row seats on the Sequoia. 900 parts in a seat set. 156 suppliers from 22 different countries. All right. So in terms of the question about how do we manage and get shared language, and that's just the seat set on a product which has existed for at least a decade. So anyway, whoever asked that question, I think it was Valerie. I just want to say, awesomely good question. So where do these mechanisms help us? One, by partitioning and coming up with these coherent units on which Valerie, Peter, and I are working on, but no one else is working on. Our need to harmonize across the language is much less difficult, because now we're harmonizing across what the three of us are talking about and not what everybody else is talking about. And picking that up, because someone's going to say, well, yeah, but you just can't have the single small coherent module. Well, then if we establish clean interfaces between how we exchange with our module back and forth with the ones we attach, then we actually reduce the amount of harmonization on language we need. Because if we have a nice, clean modular boundary, the communication that's needed across that interface is only the stuff which is flowing back and forth. What's going on behind the interface, we don't have to talk about at all. I mean, in the extreme. So anyway, Valerie, it's a wicked good question. Now, there's obviously the point, which is at someone, we can't just have, partition something up into lots of little pieces, because what we're left with is, I don't know, a Lego set which is dumped on the floor. The pieces have to come together. And that then requires, of course, someone who has responsibility for taking pieces and turning pieces into components into subsystems into larger systems, et cetera, doing that architecting of little pieces into bigger things, and making sure as that architecting is occurring that the people who are now in a collaborative conversation can talk to each other. So anyway, long and short, is not easy. And Valerie, is a fantastically good question. The problem doesn't go away through some of these mechanisms. The problem just gets easier. And here's the thing. It's like the joke, the two guys are in the woods and they hear a bear, and one guy starts to run and the other guy starts to put on sneakers, right? And the guy who's starting to run says, you're not going to outrun the bear. And the dude who's calmly lacing up the sneakers says, I don't have to outrun the bear. And it's the same thing here, which is we don't have to take hard problems and make them easy problems. We just have to take hard problems and make them easier for us than they are for other people. And so long as they're easier for us than they are for other people, that's the equivalent of having the sneakers when the bear is chasing. Let the bear catch the other guy. and let the hard problem catch the other folks, as they haven't gone through the mechanisms of creating an environment in which it's much easier for us to solve problems individually, problems collaboratively.
That's interesting. That takes me to a question by Ravi, who I think is going to implementation in many ways with his question. Yes, how are these ideas applicable in the world where we're drowning in Slacks and instant messages and other? I won't read out the list of proprietary platforms, but there's a list of proprietary platforms
Yeah, we
we've
had
used several of, and
yeah,
sort of what's going on with that. And
that's right. So, Ravi, it's a fantastic question. If we're in the midst of the frenzy, where in the book we call such a thing a danger zone, and why is that? Again, it's focusing back on conditions in which it's easier or harder for us to put our cognitive abilities to good use. So the danger zone is when we've been talking about this, we have wildly complex systems that we're trying to solve. They're fast moving, which I think Ravi is alluding to. Everything is connected to everything else. The stakes are very high. We have very little control over the situation, and we have no repeatability. That's a danger zone. And of course, what we're talking about is moving from the danger zone to the winning zone, and what's the winning zone? It's where it's much more conducive for us to actually be able to solve hard problems. So first of all, we've simplified the problems, and we've been talking about that. We've slowed down the pace, and we've had some control over it and some repeatability over it, so we can actually learn from experience or even learn from bona fide experimentation. So Ravi, bring that over to your situation, which is you're in the midst of a mess. So one of the things that we've seen has been wildly helpful for folks who are in the middle of a mess is not try and fix the whole mess all at once. And there's reason for that, right? Because the mess is running, and however difficult it is to be inside the mess, it's creating some product, some service, which one, people want, and two, you're on the hook for delivering. So you can't just sort of shut the whole thing off and say, oh, this thing is a danger zone. We want to move to this winning zone. So we're going to shut it off so we can have slow, deliberative thinking. You can't do that. What we have found is wildly useful, though, is creating a model line. And what a model line is a small piece of the larger whole. And not only that, a small piece, which is the microcosm of the much larger whole. And what's the point there is that as the larger whole is still operating at its danger zone, fast pace of ongoing performance, the folks in the model line, and it's a fewer number, can actually do work, perform, but then they can occasionally hit the pause button and say, whoa, Peter, let's do some reflection with Ravi and Valerie and think about how did that just go? All right, now let's make an update and let's get a little practice on that update and then restart it into practice. Then go through this and go through this and go through this multiple times. And what the model line has as beauty is that amidst this danger zone of complex, fast-moving, intractable performance, the model line is a place where it can be generating ideas that we can then start infusing back into the mess. So, Ravi, for example, all these proprietary platforms for communication, let's say you create a model line and say, folks, it's 3 of us, it's 5 of us, it's 10 of us. At time equals 0, no platform at all. No platform at all. And what we're going to do is we're going to work, reverse engineer this. What has to be said, from whom to whom, what content, what format? Let's find a way to do that. Next thing, let's try it again and again. And what you may discover is that you don't have to use all these platforms. Maybe it's a few. Maybe you have to use all of them, but in a much more tailored, specific way. But the point is, the model line becomes an opportunity for you and your colleagues to generate ideas quickly that you can then feed back into the larger enterprise. So, Ravi, I hope that helps.
Great. Certainly helped me. Thanks, Steve. And as you were explaining that, it took me to some questions that I think Fernanda and Sasha had asked, and they were thinking about, actually how do organizations do this? What is it that is it something that leaders have to do, and what do they do? And in the context of sort of trust and delegation, responsibility, the people that are doing this well, how is that happening?
Yes, fantastic. So just the other day, we were making a distinction between 2 mindsets. One is transactional and one is developmental. And the transactional is not where we are. It's not an MIT mindset. It's not a Sloan School mindset. But let me set it up as a straw man. Transactional mindsets go something like this, which is you do an accounting of the resources available to you. And then immediately you think, all right, well, those are the resources available to me, and they're scarce. Next thing, now my job as a leader is to figure out where to allocate those resources so that I get the most valuable use of them. Now, here's the thing I gotta say is that this transactional mindset is an incredibly pessimistic one, because it assumes that the things we have, that's all we're going to get. And then, look, that might be true, right? But it also assumes the things we have and the uses we can put them to, it's already known. It's already known. And that seems to me wildly pessimistic, because it says no matter what our situation is and no matter what disappointments we have right now today, we're going to have them tomorrow also. All right, now let's contrast that transactional mindset with a developmental one. Developmental mindset takes a look at the resources you have, and your top concern is not the scarcity of resources. Your top concern is lack of understanding of what to do with them, both why and how. Now you start thinking about what a developmental mindset takes you towards. It takes you in the direction of experimentation. It takes you in the direction of accumulating experience. It takes you in the direction of generating new data and improving upon your mindsets as you go along. Now, this carries over to how you treat your people, because in the transactional mindset, you look at and here, some of you may know I have had the great blessing of about a 20-year mentorship and I'd say friendship with Paul O'Neill, who used to run Alcoa. And just as background, I talk about this in my first book, The High Velocity Edge, and we talk about it in the course, is that Paul O'Neill was steward for Alcoa when they went from a place of tremendous on-the-job risk, which you would expect for such a heavy industrial set of work sites, to the safest employer in the country. And that was done without trade-off, right? They not only became the safest employer, but high yield, high quality, productive, effective, efficient, high quality, et cetera, et cetera. And when I would talk to Paul and say, how'd you make such a profound transformation? You could see the developmental mindset at play. Because he said, look, Steve, it was easy. I said, what do you mean it's easy? You had all those sites and tens of thousands of employees. He said, no, it's easy in terms of attitude, because everywhere else, when people walked into work every day, they would be pointed over to a locker, and they would be told, literally and figuratively, that locker, hang up your coat, put your lunch pail away, and check your brain, because you're here for your brawn. And Paul O'Neill said, all I had to do was switch the conversation, that when that person came in the door, I said to the body, thank you. Put your coat here, put your lunchbox here, but thank you for bringing this brain on the job, because now there's more intellect to solve the problems we have. So anyway, where does the developmental mindset take us? It takes us to constantly asking the question, one, have we given our colleagues opportunity in a rigorous, disciplined, educated, well-trained way to solve hard problems? And, for sure, if we've got an organization of dozens, hundreds, thousands, the transactional organization is trying to compete with 3, 5, 10, 15, 20 brains versus hundreds or thousands. Who wins that one, right? And so the developmental mindset first asks the question, are we giving people problems to solve? And then it's this layer 3 thing. Are we creating the processes, the procedures, routines by which it's so much easier for Peter and Steve and Valerie to collaborate, communicate, coordinate, and be creative? Or have we created processes, procedures, and routines which make all of that creativity so flippin' hard?
Great. Yeah. Difficult and yet easy seems to be
Right.
the concept that comes out there. And I don't know if you saw Madhu just asked a really interesting question as well, which goes to what you were just talking about, I think, which is on the one hand, the strategic design of the organization. And on the other hand, there's operation of
That's
the
right.
organization. And so what do you find, what's your comment on that question?
Yes, so I'll just encourage anyone who's thinking about this is to think about the operations within your own organization, and realize that just because you've designed something, vetted something, tested something, done all the models and scale models, validation, simulation, that once you build it and run it, it doesn't run as you intended. It's constantly breaking and behaving in ways you simply didn't expect. And it wasn't delivered, but Peter and I modeled that this morning, where we had what we thought was a workable platform, and y'all saw us go offline multiple times before we actually clicked in at 10 after the hour. Now, one of the things I'll offer is that when you take a look at your own operations and appreciate the sheer volume of problems that reality is throwing at you because of the complexity of your operations, the dynamicism of your operations, the things outside your control, don't think that the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. It is just as painfully problematic in every other operating setting you're sitting in. And so just assume that's the case. Now, here's a model, and this point, I'm going to step back into my research, back to my experiences at Toyota from the mid-90s on, is one of the things that's remarkable about their setting is the assumption that whatever they've designed operationally just won't work. And consequently, it has to be designed with all these stabilization and improvement mechanisms built in. I'll give you an example. I was in a plant just a month or two ago, and it's a beautiful thing to see when you see all these hundreds of people and parts and materials flowing in and product moving along, and just this ballet of people executing their work on putting on trim, fastening this, putting seats in electronics. I mean, it's hypnotic watching this beautiful flow of people and product and process. And if you just looked at that, you'd think like, wow, the designer of this, it must have been such intelligent design to get it to all work. And then you take a closer look and you realize for every 2 or 3, maybe 4 associates who are actually doing that physical work, there's a team leader. And that team leader is stepping in and helping here, stepping in and helping there, giving an assist over there, answering a question. And it's nonstop. Now, it looks smooth and beautiful. Why is that? Because there's a team leader for 2 or 3 or 4 other people being supported because of the frequency with which there's ups and downs in the work, there's surprises, et cetera, et cetera. And then if you keep watching, you see not only are the team leaders stepping in and helping here, assisting, that sort of thing, there's group leaders who are doing the same thing. And the group leaders also exist in a ratio of 1 group leader for only about 2 or 3 team leads. Again, why is that? Because the operating environment is so challenging because of its complexity, because of the fact it's a dynamic moving thing, that you have to have these regular stabilization tools built in just to keep it operating. But there's one other piece to this, and I appreciate the question, is that recognizing that the operating environment is going to be throwing curveballs all the time. These ratios of 2 or 3 or 4 associates per team lead means that when you turn off the line or step those people off the line while other people step on the line, that's a small coherent group. Remember the question before about common language? Well, if your working group is a few associates and a team lead, well, you can step off to the side and say, hey, let's think about what went wrong today. What can we change now to make it easier tomorrow? And if you only have a few teams per group, when that group steps off the line and another group steps onto the line, that group is actually a small, coherent, shared language kind of a group of people that can say, hey, what affected us at the group level? And how can we solve those sorts of things? So anyway, long and short, and I appreciate the question there. I think it was Madhu who asked it, is the operating environment is as challenging, confusing, and filled with uncertainty that has to be resolved as the development and design one. The only thing about the operating environment, it's fast moving. So all the more reason you have to have these feedback rich, stabilizing, learning, improvement mechanisms built into it, because it's far less forgiving than when we're in the laboratory doing development and design.
Great. Thank you, Steve. And going back to an earlier question we had here, there was something about hierarchy, and I'm just interested hearing your description of this sort of team structure.
Yeah.
Is there a tension between having that many manager roles essentially and avoiding becoming rigidly hierarchical?
Yeah. So again, a super question as to what's the purpose of hierarchy. So in the transactional world, the hierarchy exists to make sure people are making sure that people are doing what they've been told to do, right? Because again, if you think about in the transactional world, what's my concern? It's the scarcity of resources. what's my challenge? Figuring out that they're allocated for some sort of optimal way. And then what I have to do is make sure that people are doing what I told them, or otherwise we're going to be moving back from the optimal. But in the developmental world, our concern is not the scarcity of resources; it's the scarcity of understanding. And so we're setting up our organizations and actually designing our processes to allow our organizations to be super rich in terms of the distributed problem solving that goes on. So where does hierarchy come in? Is that I was mentioning this plant where I visited a month or two ago, and every time someone asked the most senior guy there about leadership, he had this gesture where his hands went up like this, and he said, "Someone say leadership." Oh, well, leadership. And I was like, leadership. And I was trying to figure out what do you mean? Why that? What seemed to be a tick? And finally, it dawned on me. See, when we draw organizational charts, particularly in the transactional world, it reflects our notion of that this is all about scarcity and resources and control and allocation of resources. So there's the person at the top, and that's the big boss. And then the big boss decides to give certain resources over here and certain resources over there. And that's the next tier of the little boxes with the pictures and the nice ties. And then it goes down and down, and the whole system decomposes to all the resources. And the whole point is that all this decomposition is answerable to the big boss at the top. And I was trying to think, well, what is this person doing with this gesture every time the word leader came up? Is leaders aren't there to tell people what to do, because in fact, the leader may not know, right? This is the developmental mindset, which is we're trying to create products, we're trying to create systems, we're trying to create processes, and we don't know what the design is or how they're going to operate. So what's the job of the leader? Is to support those people who are closer to the actual problems and create those conditions in which it's easier for them to solve problems. So when you start talking about a team leader, what is the job of the team leader? Support the associates so that when they show up to do their work, they're more likely to succeed than not. And if they can't succeed, the team leader is there to support them and help them with solving the problems that are within the coherent unit of team. And what does the group leader do? The group leader is support the team leads in creating the conditions for the team leaders to be successful, and if they're not, in a rigorous fashion, solve problems. And then when you get to the area manager as a leader, what is the job of it's to support the group leaders who are supporting the team leaders who are supporting the associates. So anyway, to this portion of hierarchy, I think when we use the notion hierarchy, we're already implying this is a transactional mindset, and it's one of command, control, audit, compliance, et cetera, et cetera. But when we start thinking about systems, from an engineering perspective, we start thinking about the partitioning of systems, we realize we have to have engineering at the component level, and we have to have engineering architecting at the subsystem level, and engineering architecting at the system level, and so on and so forth. And it really changes the notion of what the quote unquote leader is there to do. Are they there to issue instructions and enforce compliance, or are they there to create conditions, monitor conditions, and improve conditions by which the minds and hands of everybody else is well engaged?
That's great. I have this mental image of almost an umbrella. Whatever we're doing, we think we're being successful, and that's in an organization like you're describing. There's someone holding the umbrella, which is providing us with that kind of space within which we can operate.
Yep, that protected space. Moving from that danger zone where we're unprotected to that winning zone where we are. 100%.
That's really great. You talk about, you've said a few times, I think it's a very powerful idea, moving from thinking about resources and constrained resources to thinking about, quote unquote, understanding. What's our understanding deficit? So how does one measure? I know how to measure resources. How do I measure understanding?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we're going through this experience right now. It's an industrial heavy environment where and it's industrial heavy environment, and the folks we're talking about are responsible for the major overhaul on these things. And if you want to imagine what this looks like, imagine the inside of a refinery, the inside of someplace that does you got heavy pieces of equipment that handle materials that are heavy, hazardous in all sorts of different ways. And so the question is, how do you measure what you're doing? And I think we've come up with a basic one, which is when you pull these systems offline and start taking them apart, they have to go back together, and they have to go back together in a way that assures their safety, their effectiveness, their efficiency. And there's all sorts of metrics you can throw on top of that, but what's the basic one is today, was it easier to be a mechanic doing this work than it was yesterday? When that mechanic showed up to do her work, his work, did they have the materials they needed, the equipment they needed, the paperwork they needed, the information they needed, the skills they needed? The answer is yes. That's fantastic, because it means that person could be effective at creating and delivering value. But if that person showed up and that day was designed in such a way that something was missing, they were missing the equipment, the information, the material, the paperwork, whatever else, it's a simple metric. Did I, as someone supporting that mechanic, or, again, right, the leadership, if I was supporting a mechanic, did I do something today to make it easier to be a mechanic? And if I could go home and say, yeah, I did, I really, I solved the problem that affected a mechanic, or affected someone who affected a mechanic, and that problem is gone. Well, we have an understanding that we put into practice. This is ideas into action. We did that. And on the other hand, if today we can't say we made it easier to be a mechanic, then we have a reason to say, did we really come to a better understanding of the situation? And I know that doesn't come, I don't know how many significant digits after the decimal point. Did I make it easier for the mechanic? Did I make it easier for the chemist, for the biologist, the technician, the doctor, the nurse, the pharmacist? I know that doesn't have such significant digit precision, but boy, is it easy to see. Boy, is it easy to see. And so I would encourage the folks here thinking about, how do I measure this, is just the snapshot or the short video clip. What did the beginning of the day look like in the end of the day? And was it easier for us individually and collectively to see problems, solve problems, and deliver solutions that have societal value? And if the answer to that is yes, today was a win. And if the answer to that was no, then today was a chance to learn something, so tomorrow will be an even bigger win.
Yeah, we often hear the dictum, work smarter, not work harder, which maybe sort of relates to what you're describing here. But
Yeah.
can I press you, just a bit to dive a bit deeper still into this measuring the understanding deficit? Because I guess my question goes to, how would any particular leader or even whole organization benchmark themselves, know where they stand relative to competitors? Can they just look at the outcomes and outputs, or is there something that's more granular that we can try to measure? What is our understanding deficit right now, because that's what we're trying to improve on?
Yeah, is an awesome question. So the thing is, evidence would suggest, not only it would suggest, it tells us in a screamingly loud fashion. Suggest sounds like a gentle tap on the shoulder and a whisper on the ear. Now, this is bullhorn blaring amplification, right? Evidence suggests that those who know more, and know more not just sort of hypothetically, but know more in terms of ideas into action, that their ability to create and deliver value through products and services and whatever else is way off the charts compared to anybody else. So it's measurable there. And, we just have to have some faith, again, as, people of science and engineering and technology and that sort of thing, that systems which have lower impedances, less friction, less viscosity, are losing less energy to all that stuff, so that the energy can be applied towards actually moving things along. Now, in the case of this developmental mindset, what we're trying to move along is our understanding of situations. And the more we reduce the viscosity, the impedances, the friction towards people seeing and solving problems as just a regular part of their work, individually and collaboratively and collectively, then we're going to close the gap on these slow, lagged, aggregated metrics that show up in the marketplace.
That really helps me understand that. I hope that leads to everyone to some inspiration, because I'm certainly already thinking about ways of applying what you're saying there. Now, maybe as we're sort of winding up here, we could go back to, we started out by talking a little bit about sort of the journey you went on from your High Velocity Edge book to the new book on wiring the winning organization. And we talked about the fact that you've been teaching this material in various courses at the Sloan School and perhaps elsewhere as well. So what is the, what does kind of the process look like in your experience from somebody getting exposed to these ideas, maybe in a webinar like this, perhaps coming and taking a course or reading the book, and then actually doing something to implement these
Yeah.
ideas? Have you got any examples that you could share with people about how that's worked?
Absolutely. And actually, this is rooted on someone who was a graduate student at MIT, so took a course and then read the book and shared the book with her colleagues. But I'll come back to this idea: create a model line. Find some piece of the larger whole where you have some control over it, and you can make at least that piece have the characteristics of the winning zone rather than the danger zone. Because the whole thing, again, it's complex, it's fast moving, it's high stakes, it's non-repeatable, non-controllable, etc. So create something where you and some colleagues can have a simpler situation, still a microcosm, still reflective, but still, excuse me, somewhat simpler. You have some control, you can have some ideas, you can try them, you can repeat them, improve upon them, create that model line. Very specific example, someone who took a course, read the book, and shared the book with colleagues. We created a model line, and the model line was around one guy named Matt. He debugged firmware on a data storage device. And it was a beautiful experience because Matt came in and he said, well, these ideas come out of autos and, we don't make autos, but what the heck, I'll give it a try. I don't see how it's possibly going to work. But wouldn't you know, Matt diligently applies some of these ideas. And, some weeks later, he's, doubled and tripled and quadrupled his own personal productivity. And so we say to Matt, it's like, Matt, would you like to share what you've done with some of your colleagues? And this became a routine. You can see with Matt, it's like, oh, well, this might have worked for me, but it'll never work for them, but I'll give it a try anyway. So what does Matt do? He introduces it to his colleagues, and their output on this firmware debug goes up 18-fold. And then we say to Matt and his colleagues, well, it'd be nice if you could take what you're learning on your model line and share it with other people in your enterprise. And this became a thing, which is like all of them now said, well, this worked for us, but it won't work for anybody else, but we'll give it a try anyway. Well, wouldn't you know, by the time this thing had spread, and it was only about a year, 18 months, that they had so many, I'd say high dozens of few hundred people engaged in this approach of improving the conditions by which people could collaboratively solve hard problems, that the quality of their product skyrocketed, the cost of developing the product, plummeted. And Peter, this gets back to what you said, is connecting the metrics, right? It became easier and easier and easier for Matt to solve problems, and became easier and easier and easier for his colleagues, right? Every day became easier for them to do something valuable at that layer 1 benchtop work because they're spending less time trying to figure out layer 3 process procedure. So that was going on. And where did it result? It resulted in better products delivered in less time at less cost with less effort that customers appreciated. And that, of course, was the big lagging, aggregated, delayed metric of market presence. So there's a very strong linear flow between, have I made it easier for the firmware debugger, the mechanic, the nurse, the doctor, the pharmacist, the welder? Have I made it easier for them today? And connecting that as an enterprise, are we going to be more successful?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Steve. I'm just looking at the clock and realizing that we've been having such an interesting time that we've gone past the top of the hour. So I really appreciate you spending this time with us and telling us about your past, but very excitingly, your upcoming work as well. An hour does go by very quickly. And if anybody watching this would like the opportunity to spend not just an hour, but several hours, maybe a couple of days with Steve working with these ideas and this material, he does teach in several courses at the MIT Sloan School and Executive Education program. He's got one actually coming up starting on June 28th, so in just a couple of weeks, which will be on campus at MIT. And if getting to campus is a bit of a challenge, we have a live online version, which will be, I think, on November the 30th. You can find information about all of that and more on our website, executive.mit.edu. Thank you again, Steve, for being here on behalf of all the people who are watching it live and will watch the recording. We always learn so much and get so much inspiration from you, and I hope we can do this again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Peter. Really appreciate the chance.